So, William Lane Craig's moral argument goes like this. 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. 2. Objective moral values do exist. 3. Therefore God exists. I agree that objective moral values do exist, and that God grounds them, at least in some sense, and yet I believe the argument fails. And that's weird, I know, but bear with me. First, I'd like to contend that there are two ways to understand the first premise. The first is epistemological in nature. Given this understanding, the premise asserts the following. If we were to suddenly find out that God doesn't exist, we would have to conclude that morality therefore also does not exist. Here I would have to disagree fundamentally. The second understanding of the first premise is ontological. In the case that God does not exist, objective morality does not exist. I can agree with this reading of the premise and still think the argument fails. Now, this seems hopelessly confused, since if the premise is true in the ontological sense, it seems it has to be true in the epistemological sense as well. And I do believe the premise to be true in the second sense. So what's the issue then? I believe that what grounds morality in the primary sense is the nature of phenomenal experience of sentient creatures. Whatever explains the qualitative nature of these experiences, the fact is that we know that creatures experience these phenomena. We know the suffering inflicted by experiences of pain and the joys of pleasure, and these phenomena give us objective reasons to act in certain ways rather than others. Everybody who has been in some state of suffering knows that such a state is objectively bad, and therefore has objective reasons to act in ways that reduce the occurrence of such states. But grounding morality in such a way comes with serious problems. If the existence of sentient beings grounds morality, then we have the weird scenario in which morality comes into existence with the existence of such creatures. We wouldn't want to say that morality begins to exist with the evolution of sentience and then might disappear in the next instance, only to maybe reappear, only to vanish again. We may want to express moral statements in the ways of hypothetical imperatives. If there are beings that suffer needlessly from action X, X is impermissible. In this sense, then, objective morality is based on the possibility of qualitative experience. It is grounded modally, and since modality is fixed, at least given most accounts of modality, we have a solid basis for the grounding of moral statements. We can reformulate the statement I gave to, if there is a possible world W1 that contains beings that would suffer needlessly from action X, X is impermissible in W1. So if morality is grounded modally, doesn't that already show that the argument fails? Not so quick. Modal statements such as sentient beings may exist need to be grounded themselves in something. I believe the truth of contingent propositions is grounded in the powers of a necessary being, i.e. God, to actualize contingent state of affairs. One doesn't need to agree, but let's just assume the truth of this statement. It seems that now the argument does indeed work. If God's nature grounds modal truth, and modal truth grounds moral truth, then by transitivity, God grounds modal truth, at least in some sense. Case closed, the argument is great. But not so quick. Let's reassess the first premise in light of what I just stated. 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. If we assume God exists necessarily, that is, he cannot not exist. So by assuming he does not exist, we explore the implications of a necessarily false proposition. We explore what is sometimes called an impossible world. Now, if we read the first premise in the ontological sense, then it's completely uninteresting. If God, as naturally conceived, is the creator of everything besides himself, we would simply have an empty world devoid of any content and, of course, without objective morality. If someone doesn't already agree that God exists, how would that convince him of anything? Yet, remember my epistemological reading of the first premise. If we were to suddenly find out that God does not exist, we would have to conclude that morality therefore also does not exist. But given what I argued, this statement is surely false. If by impossibulum God does not exist and yet sentient beings still exist, then morality would still be objective in this world, since morality is grounded by the possibility of sentience, which is assumed to be actual. And that is to say that, if I were to suddenly conclude that God does not exist, I would conclude that God does not ground modal facts, since he doesn't exist. But I surely would not doubt the possibility of sentience, and would therefore not conclude that objective morality does not exist. When apologists state that, if God does not exist, then actions like rape, torture, child abuse, etc. are not objectively wrong, they are not just stating something that is objectively despicable. I think they are committing themselves to a void and shallow moral theory, or they are committing a mistake in modal thinking while exploring an impossible world. And that's objectively bad.